Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm János Pastor, Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative C2G, and I'm speaking today with Kim Stanley Robinson, an American science fiction writer. He's the author of about 20 books, including the internationally best-selling Mars trilogy, and more recently, Red Moon, New York 2140, and The Ministry for the Future. He was part of the U.S. National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers Program in 1995 and 2016, and a featured speaker at COP26 in Glasgow as a guest of the UK government and the United Nations. His work has been translated into 28 languages and won awards including the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards. In 2016, asteroid 72432 was named Kim Robinson. I read The Ministry for the Future, and it actually has a lot to do with the work of C2G on the governance of techniques like solar radiation modification, or SRM for short. We will refer to this book, The Ministry, in this discussion from time to time. However, this episode of C2GTalk is not a comprehensive interview about the Ministry for the Future. The episode will also be the last C2GTalk episode, given that at the end of 2023, in just over a month from the time of recording, C2G will close down. We're doing this as we have always said that we would, as C2G was a time-limited initiative. More importantly, however, we believe that we have achieved our mission objectives, and it is therefore time to close down. But now, let's get to the discussion with Kim Stanley Robinson today. Stan, welcome to C2GTalk.
Well, thank you, János. It's good to be with you.
Great. So let's start with what you could call the elephant in the room, the climate crisis. In April 2022, you wrote to me an email while you were in India, and I quote, "Right now, I am in Dharamsala, but Thursday we'll go to Delhi, where it's all too much like the first chapter of Ministry. Your project becomes more pressing every day." End of quote. It looks like you experienced during your visit to India an episode of extreme weather, of extreme heat. The world saw many other episodes of extreme weather in the last few years: floods, forest fires, and heat. So how do you see the evolution of the climate crisis, especially in the last few years since you wrote Ministry of the Future? For the Future, sorry.
Yeah, well, I have spent the last 3 years since the book came out traveling and doing Zoom conferences like this, more or less continuously, and I can tell that people are hungry for the story that book tells of us coping more or less successfully with the climate change crisis, or the poly crisis, as it's being called now, because of biosphere collapse and pandemics and other problems that all snarl into one knot. And I think two things to answer your question. One, the pandemic was a slap in the face to everybody paying attention. It became very clear that the biosphere could kill you, and that when the biosphere became dangerous, everything changed. And so since then, there's a before and after for me, and maybe for everybody. Before the pandemic, climate change was always a problem for the next generation. After the pandemic, it's a belief that it's us now that have to deal with it now. And the other thing, of course, the increasing catastrophes, the extreme weather events in the last few years, they seem to have accelerated in their severity and their frequency. And then this last year, 2023, the temperatures, global average temperatures, have shot up to a shocking degree. The scientific community is, I would say, shocked that it could happen. And already we're getting explanations, as from James Hansen and his team, that maybe clearing the air of some aerosols has allowed the Earth to heat up, which is maybe shows the cross-cutting of the various procedures that we're going to do going forward. there are going to be some things we need to do for human health that actually might heat the planet up a little bit more, which is instructive as to going forward, what we may have to do. So I just got back from a trip through Europe speaking to international agencies about attitudes towards the future. That's really the only thing that I have an expertise in that they don't. And I more than ever, I have the feeling that everybody wants to act. They're looking at everybody else, who goes first and who pays for it. This is exactly the first step in not dealing with it, is the idea that it will be someone else and it'll be later on. And that's, I think, the moment of hesitation. But this year we have indeed, the science is telling us that the temperatures have gone off the charts, you can say. A year unprecedented in how fast it's heating up. There's a well-known danger of us losing control of the Earth system, which is to say, falling over tipping points where no matter what we do, the heating will continue to increase. And at that point, we truly would be in a catastrophe that we're poorly designed to, as a society, to cope with. So I think we're at a moment of danger, but the pandemic gives us a little bit of help in imagining how to cope with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Coming back to very much focused on climate, literally in less than a week from this recording, COP28 is going to start in Dubai. And you wrote in chapter 3 of the ministry, and I quote, the first global stocktake in 2023 did not go well. Emissions were far higher than the parties to the Paris Agreement had promised each other they would be, end of quote. So what are your expectations from COP28 now, a few years after you wrote that, and from the COP process in general?
Yeah, well, I laugh when you read that because I wrote it in 2019, those sentences. And so I was just sticking a pin in the wall and making a statement that seemed likely to be true. And it is pretty true because we weren't doing much in 2019. In fact, I feel like in 2019, we were distinctly less worried and less active than we are now. So that could be taken as a kind of a positive. And I think COP28 will be more on point, more aware of the danger than I thought it would be when I wrote in 2019, where I didn't imagine the impact of the pandemic, nor of this year, 2023. I'm interested that it's going to be in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, and therefore right at the heart of fossil fuel production. I'm interested that the Pope is going to be there for several days as a leader of one of the largest religions on earth, and he's very intent to make a difference there. So these are two factors that make this COP different than the ones immediately previous to. Mm-hmm. I don't know what will happen because nobody does, and really. It's a mistake to think that science fiction writers are any better at thinking the future than anyone else. These are absolutely ordinary skills and modes of thought that science fiction writers bring to bear. Everybody has them. Everybody uses them in their daily life. It's only just the telling of very long stories that makes science fiction writing different. So I guess from my own observations at COP26 in Glasgow, I would say the venue where it happens doesn't matter that much. Who the president is doesn't matter that much. The 40,000 or say the 40,000 diplomats who are going to be negotiating a new set of promises, because it's part of the Paris Agreement that every year the promises get improved over the previous year in a kind of a ratcheting function. What statement will come out this year with the extra spur of the temperature rise of this year to frighten people into saying we have to do more and faster? Well, but every nation has to agree. This consensus model is very strict. The Paris Agreement is written, yeah. So what will every nation agree to, including Russia, including Saudi Arabia, including Brazil, including Canada, including China and the United States, of course. What will the island nations agree to? So I would expect that the statement coming out of COP28 will be generally regarded as a disappointment because it will be rather modest compared to the need for speed and money. But it will be progress, and people will have spent 2 weeks thinking about nothing else. It will be top of the world news along with the active wars. And so it's a ritual event that has importance for that, if for nothing else.
Well, that's an important part, and if that raises more awareness, not just of individuals but of companies, of civil society organizations, all the better. Now, let's just come back to these temperatures, because you yourself said that, referred to it already twice, I think, that the temperatures are getting off the chart. Just literally the day before this recording, UNEP published its latest emissions gap report, an annual report that they produced, and the numbers are worse than last year's. Now, even according to this report, the world is heading to 3 degrees warming if trends continue, and to somewhere between 2.5 to 2.9 if current plans are implemented. So the world is getting hotter, and the impacts are also worse than previous analysis indicate. So the question I have is, has it become inevitable to ascertain that solar radiation modification can or cannot be used and to take action accordingly? Is this the time?
Yes, that's my answer in brief, is yes. And I, of course, need to explain why. We are in what I would call, and I think I've heard this term elsewhere, a carbon dioxide overshoot. In fact, it might even have been you, Janos, who introduced this term to me. I'm not sure because of the influx of information. Carbon dioxide.
We usually talk about temperature overshoot because of the excess carbon dioxide, no?
Yeah, but I want to speak specifically of the carbon dioxide overshoot. There's too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We put it there, and as long as it remains, we are in danger of losing control of the Earth system to runaway greenhouse heating. So we're going to have to draw down a whole lot of carbon dioxide, billions of tons. Perhaps 100 billion tons, but in any case, billions of tons. That will be subject to negotiation in the decades to come. How much do we pull down? Because it does have an immediate impact on temperatures, and that will be a negotiated settlement once it becomes a technological possibility. We can put it up there a lot faster than we can take it down, because it's the entirety of industrial civilization burning fossil fuels that's putting it up there. Drawing it down will be nature-based solutions. It may be giant vacuum cleaners. It will be every method that we can bring to bear. It will nevertheless be a very small percentage of the burn of putting it up there in these last decades. So some time's going to pass, decades, where we have more CO2 in the atmosphere and therefore more heat in the Earth system than is good for the biosphere and therefore for civilization. If during that time we can bounce some sunlight away with the solar radiation modifications, and there are other methods, as you know, then it might help a lot in reducing the damage, stabilizing sea level to the extent that we can, and coping better, and making sure that food supplies are not horribly damaged, for instance, which is really, to me, the immediate danger. So yes, the time has come to understand what solar radiation modification means, and also how to govern it, which I know has been your principal focus, the governance issues. How would we decide? Because the deployment itself is a technical question that is, I think, solvable quicker than the governance issues. Let's put it that way.
So with that, what you just said, I go back to the quote from your letter from India last year, when you said that your work becomes more pressing every day. That's our work at C2G. I think I understand better what you had to say about that. It's about understanding, and it's about the governance issues that are so difficult, so challenging. But from your perspective, Stan, how would we go about this to prepare society to better understand? Because it's a controversial topic. What you said just now, some people agree, some people will vehemently disagree. So how does one go about this?
Well, I think continuously talking about it and also challenging the objections as being objections from an earlier time when we weren't in a climate emergency, and that even in the 90s, solar radiation modification was being discussed. And always the objections are the same. And now some of them I think have to be challenged as invalidated by the current crisis. Specifically, the moral hazard argument, that if we knew we had a method of cooling down the Earth, we would therefore continue to burn fossil fuels heedlessly because we knew we had a get out of jail card, as it would be called in American games. That's called the moral hazard argument. Well, I think that argument is now completely irrelevant. We know we have to reduce emissions as fast as possible. That's what the COP meetings are about. We know it. Everybody knows it. We will be doing that no matter what emergency gestures we discuss. So the idea now of solar radiation modification is not any kind of a inducement to give up the effort to decarbonize fast, neither reducing emissions nor even decarbonizing the atmosphere by various natural and artificial means. That's all going to be ongoing in an emergency way. And if you could have the temperatures lower during that crisis, then more and more it begins to look like, well, if you have a medical example, if you have a patient in a fever, then you do certain things to reduce the fever while you go at the source of the complaint. And so solar radiation modification could be seen as putting the patient in a bath of cold water, or giving them some ability to cool down while their fundamental problem is cured, hopefully. And I think that with the moral hazard argument off the table, the other arguments, oh, we're sure to mess it up, something worse is sure to happen. This is just superstition out of the novel Frankenstein or some early fantasies of Faust. It's really almost Goethe's Faust, the myth of if we were to use our own invented powers, they would be devilish and we would doom ourselves to a worse fate than even if we had tried to do something. The proper way to apply that myth is industrial civilization itself has torched the planet by accident. You don't have to suggest there was malign intent. Burning of fossil fuels looked good until we discovered that its waste was going into the atmosphere and changing the climate. So the whole myth of, oh, something worse is sure to happen, that always also needs to be challenged. It's not true. If we lower temperatures around the Earth for a couple of decades while we decarbonize, that might keep millions from dying. Now, there might be, and this is where experiments could come into play, or modeling exercises or further discussion, it might be that doing this in particular ways might harm the monsoon or change rainfall patterns. But the truth is that it's the rise in CO2 has already harmed monsoons, has already changed rain patterns. And we cannot distinguish what's happened because of the rise of CO2 that we've put there and the Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines in 1991 or 94. So what I'm saying is the monsoon, like any weather patterns, is already irregular, partly because of us, partly because weather is always irregular. So there's no sure science saying if we do some solar radiation modification, these bad side effects are sure to happen. That always needs to be challenged. We simply don't know.
Mhm. Yeah. At C2G, we often talked about this issue of the moral hazard, but at the same time also talk about what some others talk about, the moral imperative, that the situation is getting so bad that we also need to think of this as a moral imperative. And we talked about the balance of these two, that both are there. What if I understood you correctly, you seem to be saying that the climate crisis, as it is showing itself, is shifting this toward the moral imperative as opposed to the moral hazard, to
Yes,
understand and to learn about this new technique.
yes, I would say that's very true. And also that I would also assert that the moral hazard argument has flatly gone away. It is no longer, it no longer obtains. It's not a valid argument anymore
Mhm.
because the everybody who is paying attention and believes that the scientific community has given us an accurate representation, and I say that's 95% of humanity, because everybody, when they're frightened for their own personal life, they run to a scientist. So everybody understands we have to decarbonize. So the moral hazard argument that, oh, if we had even the idea of solar radiation modification, we would stop decarbonizing, that just simply isn't true.
Mhm. Okay. Let's go back to one of your earlier books, the Mars trilogy, which you wrote in the early 90s. And some observers have said that this is the manual being used by Elon Musk to plan Mars's colonization. And I could not imagine a better example of the Anthropocene as humanity trying to make Mars livable. Now, with the Anthropocene, of course, being the period in Earth's history when humanity has started making significant and lasting impacts on the Earth's geology and ecosystems. But remaining on Earth and being conscious of the polycrises that you yourself mentioned earlier, covering not just climate, but biodiversity loss, pandemics, food systems, socioeconomic crises, and of course, wars, especially as we're seeing it more recently again. How do you see humanity's role vis-a-vis nature in this Anthropocene? Do we continue to rely on scientific and technological progress to fix the challenges and become ever more powerful, where not even the sky is the limit, but perhaps space and eventually the galaxy? Or do we humbly recognize our limits and try to live with nature within those limits? How do you think about these?
Mars right now is completely unimportant to humanity. It sits there. It's interesting and beautiful, and in thousands of years it might become an engineering project. Right now it just is a red dot in the sky. And in thinking about what happened to Mars, we can do some comparative planetology. Mars was once wet and warm, and then it wasn't. Why did that happen? When we study that, we are learning more things about Earth. And it was the contention of Lovelock and Margulis that Earth, being a watery planet, was a result of its living biological community, creating chemical conditions that allow water not to be dispersed off into space.
Mhm.
And so more and more we're understanding that this planet is a biological active community that can be thrown off of its balance. There have been times in Earth's history where it was an ice ball. All the water on this planet was frozen. There's other times where there's been no ice at all on the planet. All the water was liquid or gaseous. So there is variability within ordinary Earth systems. And now we've done an enormously disruptive thing by pouring CO2 into the atmosphere faster than it ever has happened by natural events. We're in an experiment of our own making by accident. So when we talk about the other planets, it's not completely irrelevant because we're on a planet. So we use space science as a kind of an Earth science. And I still believe in it for that. But
Mhm.
for everything else, these dreams of escape or these dreams of colonization, they are at this point irrelevant to human history, and they probably will be for literally hundreds of years.
So we have to figure this out ourselves here on Earth, but we can learn perhaps from the other planets, including Mars.
Yes.
Let's now look at one of your more recent book, The Ministry for the Future. Maybe the first question I wanted to ask about that is why you decided to write about the climate crisis, including the potential role of solar radiation modification in that story. You could have written about the nuclear war, pandemics was not that obvious at that time, but there were many other existential crises in the world. So why did you choose that topic?
Well, by the time I came to write Ministry for the Future, I had been writing about climate change for about 20 or 25 years. It starts with my Antarctic novel. And indeed, as I just explained, the Mars novel is somewhat about climate change indirectly in a metaphorical way. But starting with Antarctica, when I went to Antarctica in 1995, the scientists down there were all telling me about climate change and what it could do to sea level. I became interested, and then, I mean, I probably have written a dozen novels since then. At least half of them have been climate fiction. In particular, my Science in the Capital trilogy is starting with 40 Signs of Rain. In one volume, it's called Green Earth, about Washington, D.C. in a time of rapid climate change. If the Gulf Stream were to stall, then this famously would change weather patterns very quickly. And I located that story in Washington, D.C., thinking, what would the federal government do? What would the National Science Foundation do faced with a crisis that might have a scientific solution? So already I've been writing about it. And so science fiction, it has all of the future as its subject matter, and therefore it breaks down into different kinds of stories. Far future science fiction is space opera, like Star Trek or Star Wars. The middle distance is like my Mars trilogy. What will humanity be like 200 or 300 years from now? That, to me, is an extremely interesting speculative exercise, because 200 years is a long time, the way history is going now in terms of changes. Then near future science fiction is, I used to call it the day after tomorrow. It's a way of looking at right now with a slight push into the future to show where trends might lead very quickly. Near future science fiction has become climate fiction because climate change is an overriding and overdetermining situation. If you're going to write about the near future now, climate change needs to be in the story, or else you haven't actually imagined the near future very well. You could focus on other things. You could focus on nuclear war or the danger of it, or on artificial intelligence and what it might bring or wouldn't bring. But climate change would always have to be the happening in the story, or else you're writing some kind of a fantasy.
So looking at this near-term climate fiction, one question one could ask is, to what extent the narratives that are provided in these climate fiction stories, to what extent do these narratives actually help or can help development of policy? And specifically, do you think that ideas in the ministry help policymakers and their advisors today to address the climate crisis?
Well, these are good questions, Janos, and I have been thinking about them a lot. Mostly climate fiction. Well, let me put it more generally. Fiction is usually about individual characters, and you focus in on individuals and then their relationship to their family, to their friends, to their jobs, to their immediate social surround, then also to their moment, their society, or their moment in history. And that's at the biggest stretch of the novel, as in the classic tradition of the 19th century realist novel, Balzac, George Eliot, Conrad, the relationship of individual characters in their own individual adventures to the larger press of history. Well, a lot of novels have given up on the larger press of history and just gotten into the inner psychological states of individual characters. But we read novels to get inside other people's heads and experience other people's lives in different times and places. It's a mental adventure that is very important and can be beautiful. Once you get to climate change, and the expanse of the novel goes from the individual to their friends and family, to their society, to their moment in history, to their planet, that is when science fiction becomes useful, because science fiction is always about planets, individuals, and planets as the ultimate conditioning of our lives. So climate change is hard to turn into novels, and science fiction, by putting the story in the future and having things happen to your characters that are representative of what will happen to everybody, that's where they get interesting. And many a climate fiction novel will show the individuals thrown out of their ordinary middle class or bourgeois lives. And so it will generally, characters will not be the poorest people for whom they're already in crisis, and the novel is not good at them. The novel is classically about the middle class, and middle class people thrown out of their lives and become desperate because of climate change. And then they're on the run, like in a chase movie, and they manage to make some accommodation that is more limited, that is improvised, that it becomes an adventure. So in some cases, it's felt as a sort of liberation, because your ordinary middle class life was so boring, so suburban, so predictable, so stuck in offices, so much without meaning. And then suddenly you're on the run, coping with a new group of people to try to survive and do a Robinson Crusoe, a wreckage of civilization, followed by, can you improvise your way to a life where you stay alive? This is what climate fiction is most of the time. And I'll quickly come to the end of this. Ministry for the Future is not like that. It's a novel in which the ordinary workings of society as we built it, including the nation-state system and including global capitalism and including the international agencies that have been invented since World War II, all together trying to improvise a solution where you don't have a breakdown of society, not a complete one. And at the end of the story, we have managed to scrape through. 30, 40 years later on, the same characters are living their lives, and their lives' work has actually, in some aggregate sense, succeeded because we didn't have a breakdown of the biosphere. We didn't have a mass extinction event. We didn't have social breakdown. Well, that story is unusual enough that the book has gotten the attention that it has because people want that story.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say, and in a recent interview with the Financial Times, you said something that I found was quite interesting, and I quote, "Now I am meeting policymakers and powerful people who are terrified and want to act. That's new in my experience." So my specific question here is, to what extent these decision makers that you're meeting, these policymakers, powerful people, are they getting useful ideas from the way you just described it, of avoiding the worst and sort of modeling through and convert, and is that helpful to actually come up with policies that will get us in that direction?
Well, mostly no, but maybe a little yes. And what I mean by that is almost all of the people that I meet with that have expertise in the areas that Ministry for the Future writes about, they want to tell me more. They suggest to me that what I wrote was a kind of a simplified symbol for what they do, which is in reality vastly more complicated. Now that's okay. That's what fiction is about. It's a sort of a simplification, or you speak of the individual when you meet an entire class of people, etc. But I think what they're getting out of the book is the suggestion that their work, although inadequate in itself, is just one part of a much larger effort that they see could succeed by the story that the novel tells. So they have more detail about their area of expertise. Say it's the novel's Carbon Coin. They know that this is a name for a whole class of financial instruments that they know more about, and much more has happened since I wrote the book in terms of financing green work. But the story in the novel suggests that the work they're doing is crucial work and that it could succeed. Now, this might be a political fantasy. The novel might turn out, 30, 50 years from now, if somebody were to come across a thrown apart copy of Ministry for the Future, they'd say, oh, that was a fantasy of somebody who was too scared to face up to the fact that we were doomed even then, because we're doomed now. That could happen, because any novel set in the future is a guess and an act of speculation. Something different is going to happen. Already that's been proved true by the pandemic appearing. And every step along the way is going to be different than Ministry, but I'll say this, it's going to happen faster than I portrayed in the Ministry. It's happening at an accelerated speed, and it's happening with articulations across the board such that the policymakers, and I'm talking about diplomats, technocrats, scientists, business leaders who are actually deciding where investments and work should go, and then also elected politicians. But it's that technocratic class of people it's their jobs to work on these things. They are all energized, and it's become the principal problem of our time. And so their work has intense existential meaning. So like I go to one of these, and you yourself coming out of the UN, someone else said to me, the UN is like the nation states are like professional golfers. And the UN is like the people who drive the golf carts from one tee to the next. And so they're thinking their work is important, and then they're realizing they're just driving around these big players from the nation states who are doing the real work of negotiation. Now, when I speak to people in international agencies, and I'm talking about WTO, OECD, the EU bureaucracy in Brussels, and UN people themselves, they are all wondering if their work is becoming crucial because the nation states can't get it done and need to coordinate, and have created the international agencies to get certain things done. And now we need them done more than ever. And indeed, the COP process is an example of that happening.
One of the challenges, of course, here is that while the representatives of those organizations may think that way, but the nation states keep them from doing that.
Yes.
Not giving them enough power, not giving them enough mandates, and we see it all over the place.
Yes, that's true. In fact, that was the main impression I got from my most recent trip to Europe, where I spoke sequentially to WTO, OECD, EU, and then also afterwards with some people in the State Department in the US, part of a nation state, but only one part. The sense that the member states of these organizations are dragging them backwards by way of their own parochial concerns, by the zero-sum game. Oh, if those other nations win, then we have lost. So I don't think that, this is why I said at the beginning, everybody's waiting for someone else to make the move, at which point everybody's ready to act. But who goes first and who pays for it? Now, this recent meeting between China and the United States in San Francisco, and putting climate change near the top of where they need to cooperate, no matter their competition, that was an incredibly positive sign going into COP28. The Pope coming to COP28 to try to add moral urgency to everybody's work there, to inspire the nation states to be a little less stingy, conservative, small-minded. This is what the nation state diplomats come in with instructions from home. Stay safe, stay small, don't offer any money. This is what the diplomats come to the COP meeting under instructions. Then they start talking to each other. Well, this is what we really need. Let's go back and see what we can get approval for back home. But I would agree with you. The nation states are right now the drag on action.
Stan, we talked a lot about the short-term future, the longer-term future. Maybe if I could just ask you as we wrap up, how you see the future in the next 10 years to half a century during the time of our children and our grandchildren and their lifetime. What would be your key message to the young of today, based on that image of that vision of the next few decades?
Well, I'm like everybody else. I don't know what's going to happen. So one plays a game, a speculation game, and it's not prediction or prophecy. It's just a scenario or a modeling exercise. Based on where we are right now and where things seem to be going, I think the 2020s will be increasingly stressed between like a graph, like this graph of the temperatures from last summer. The differential between what we know we have to do and what we are actually doing in the world will increase. The difference, the inadequacy of our responses will remain true for a while, but there's also growing momentum to green work in the central banks, in private capital, in government circles, even in the nation state, national defense, the militaries of the world, realizing if they were really intent to defend their country, climate change mitigation would be part of it. So I wonder if this 2020s will feel increasingly stressed as we realize we aren't acting fast enough, if there might not then be a kind of a tide shift of enough effort to try to bring the two back together between what we need to do and what we're actually doing, might develop an enormous energy in this next decade. And then beyond that, we might end up in a world where we feel like, oh my gosh, humanity isn't so stupid after all. We actually coped with an existential crisis. That too would be energizing. But to young people, I would say to them, you're never going to be out of this. Your whole life, you're going to be living in a climate change scenario of one sort or another, either better or worse. And the worst could be so bad that you need to devote your whole life to trying to make it better. And this is basically what I'm saying to young people. No matter what kind of work they go into, it will end up having a climate change aspect to it. The humanities, the arts, engineering, of course, diplomacy, of course, all the sciences, the whole broad band of human activities are going to have to be part of the climate change struggle to get into balance with this biosphere. So since you can't escape it, you have to accept it as a kind of a task, like in these silly fantasy novels, out of the Middle Ages, Lord of the Rings or the like. You're given a task that you can't say no to. It's your generation's responsibility, and it's maybe better than meaninglessness. But in any case, you can't escape it. We're stuck in it.
I hope I'm reading you correctly, but I do sense a certain optimism from what you say, in spite of some of the huge challenges that we're facing. So if I read you correctly, then my last question would be, what gives you this ability to still be optimistic?
Well, I hang to it by my fingernails. We are in a very dangerous situation. There's no doubt about it. And extraordinary things may have to happen. One way or another, it's going to be extremely strange. So, okay, I hold on to hope as a political position, as a kind of moral obligation. Oh, you talked about the moral imperative as opposed to the moral hazard. The imperative is we continue to work as if it could succeed. And whether it succeeds or not, will certainly people our age, we won't know the outcome. But you have to proceed on the basis that if we all did our parts correctly, we could succeed still. And also success, it's a case of better or worse. It's a case of fewer extinctions rather than more extinctions, and a case of less human suffering rather than more human suffering. So it's not an easy black or white, either or, success or failure. It's more better or worse. And you have to keep on struggling towards the better, no matter the obvious dangers. Because at this point, pessimism is a kind of cowardice. You need optimism as a way to beat your opponents in the political battle, and to try to convince people that it's worthwhile doing the better things, because it's important to try to get to a better result.
With that, Kim Stanley Robinson, thank you very much for your books, for your ideas, and for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Janos. It's been a pleasure, our 2 years association. And I know you will hate to hear this, but I think C2G should actually tack on an extra couple years.